Official history paints the 17th century as an era of turmoil, endless revolts, and the difficult rise of the Romanov dynasty. It was a time when the state, torn apart by internal conflicts and invasions, slowly pieced itself back together. But what if this entire sequence of events we know is just a facade, hiding a drama on a completely different, global scale? There are facts that don't just fit poorly into the conventional picture, they completely overturn it. The time has come to open this black box of history and closely examine what lies inside. The anomalies and oddities that suggest the true events of that time were something else entirely. The beginning of the 17th century was marked by an event that feels more like a biblical apocalypse than a historical fact. Suddenly, the sun vanished from the sky. For 3 long years, as the poet Constantin Balmont described it, a gloom settled over the land. These were the dark days of Boris Godunov, when, in the gloom of the Russian land, crowds of people wandered without food. Summer never arrived. Ceaseless rains and early frosts destroyed harvest after harvest, condemning millions to a slow, agonizing famine. The picture painted by the poet is blood-curdling. A prolonged cry of "Bread! Bread! Bread!" rose from the starving people to the Tsar himself. On the city streets, emaciated shadows of people plucked grass like cattle. Humanity was stripped away, replaced by the primitive instincts of survival. Despair and ruin were everywhere. According to legends, battles of unearthly armies unfolded in the heavens, and unseen birds descended upon the land. It was a time of total chaos and collapse, which a modern person would unhesitatingly call the aftermath of a global catastrophe. Historians and climatologists offer a rational explanation for these horrifying events. In the year 1600, on the other side of the world in Peru, the colossal volcano Huayna Putina erupted. An enormous amount of ash and sulfur compounds was ejected into the stratosphere, forming a dense veil that shrouded the planet and reflected sunlight. This caused a sharp drop in temperatures worldwide, known as the Little Ice Age, leading to crop failures and mass starvation. The theory is coherent, logical, and scientifically sound. But does it account for the full scale of what happened? There is another, far more radical hypothesis. According to this view, the years without summer were not the result of a natural cataclysm, but the direct consequence of a powerful external impact, with effects comparable to a nuclear winter. This version suggests the planet was struck by a series of blows so devastating that they not only changed the climate, but literally reshaped the face of the Earth. It speaks of giant silicon trees that burned in the fire of these explosions. Their wood, containing silicon, turned to ash, which then formed multi-meter-thick layers of clay that covered the entire previous world. Strangely, this fantastical theory finds indirect support in chemistry. The composition of slag left after burning coal is nearly identical to that of common clay. This perspective also explains a fundamental shift in construction. Ancient civilizations built their structures from stone, limestone, or granite, while later buildings, standing literally on a layer of clay, are made from fired brick. It seems a new world was built from the ashes of the old. If this theory is to be believed, the impact was targeted at the centers of ancient civilization, especially Siberia, which is described as a completely devastated and scorched region. But all of this might seem like just a bold hypothesis, a flight of fancy. However, if we set aside ancient legends and poetic imagery, is there more tangible material evidence that civilization was effectively reset and forced to start over? To find it, we must look not at the reigns of czars and court intrigues, but at the backbone of any state, its industry. After all, the ability to produce metal, tools, and weapons defines a society's true strength and technological level. And it is in the state of industry at the beginning of the 17th century that we find anomalies difficult to explain by political turmoil alone. To understand the depth of the industrial collapse that occurred at the turn of the century, we need to step back to more stable times. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Moscow was not just a capital, but a significant manufacturing center. Near the Kremlin, by the Neglinka River, stood the famous Cannon Court. It was a state-of-the-art enterprise for its time, casting powerful cannons and resonant bells from copper and bronze. The technologies were complex, requiring high skill, and foreign specialists were actively recruited to implement them. Chronicles preserve the names of Italians Pavel and Piotr Friazin, and later the Dutchman Aloysius Coët and the Nürnberger Johann Falk. This shows that the state not only possessed metallurgical capabilities, but was also integrated into the European technological exchange. A center of expertise existed, capable of producing sophisticated and high-demand products. It seemed the country had a solid industrial foundation. And then, against this backdrop, the 17th century arrives, and the picture changes beyond recognition. After the mysterious years without summer and the subsequent time of troubles, we see a state that seems to have forgotten how to do what it once did so well. The industrial potential accumulated over previous centuries has vanished. Russia, which had recently produced its own artillery, now falls into a humiliating dependence on imports. Iron, which was never of the highest quality, now has to be purchased in huge quantities from Sweden, overpaying enterprising Dutch merchants who controlled the sea routes. The situation with weaponry was even worse. Firearms, swords, armor, all of it was now imported from the Netherlands, Germany, and England. The treasury spent fabulous sums, but there was no other choice. This raises the main, bewildering question. Where did it all go? Where did the factories, the craftsmen, and the technologies disappear? Why was a country with its own cannon court thrown back decades, if not centuries, forced to rely on artisanal production? And artisanal is exactly what remained of the once centralized arms industry. In place of factories, there were small forges. The main production centers became the outskirts of Tula and the village of Pavlovo near Nizhny Novgorod. There, independent and state-employed blacksmiths tried to make what were then called samopals, or handguns, from hand-wrought iron, smelted by peasants in primitive furnaces. The quality of these weapons, of course, was no match for European models. Documents from that era, such as a 1628 decree on the production of muskets in the town of Ustyuzhna Zheleznopolskaya, are filled with requirements that seem self-evident today. Masters were strictly ordered to forge barrels thoroughly, so they would be fit for firing, straight, and free of cracks and flaws. The very existence of such instructions speaks to an extremely low overall level of production. The state desperately tried to increase the output of any weapon, no matter how crude. Archival data shows a sharp rise in orders for cannonballs. If in 1629, Ustyuzhna was ordered to forge 16,000, by 1632, the order was for nearly 340,000. But these were all stopgap measures, incapable of solving the systemic problem of technological regression. In this atmosphere of total industrial decline and expensive imports, a glimmer of hope appears. In 1632, an enterprising Dutchman, Andries Vinius, along with his brother, submitted a petition to Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich. He proposed to build modern ironworks in Russia, capable of producing high-quality metal and casting cannons equal to Swedish ones. For the depleted treasury, this was a salvation. Permission was granted. And this is where things get truly interesting. The moment when foreigners arrive to build the first factories, as they are called in documents, becomes a key point in our investigation. The very term first sounds strange, given the prior existence of the cannon court. It's as if the entire preceding history of industrial development had simply been erased. But even more bizarre and enigmatic is the location that Vinius and his partners choose for construction. This choice, seemingly devoid of any logic, becomes the main piece of evidence pointing to the true scale of the catastrophe that had befallen the country. And so, in 1632, the revival of Russian metallurgy began. Andreas Vinius receives the Tsar's permission and starts construction. It is here that we encounter the first fundamental anomaly, one that breaks all conventional logic of economic development. Where would you expect to see a cutting-edge industrial facility being built? Likely in the capital, Moscow, where administrative resources and the remnants of the old workforce were concentrated. Or in a major provincial city like Tula, Kaluga, or Serpukhov, where there are markets, labor, and at least some infrastructure. But the choice falls on a completely unexpected location. The first water-powered ironworks in Russia is built literally in an open field, on the small Tulitsa River, 15 versts from the city of Tula. Not in the city itself, nor in its suburbs, but at a significant distance, in a place described as the site of some old Tula settlement. This choice of location becomes even more mysterious when we examine the production logistics. Any modern engineer or economist would tell you that a metallurgical plant should be located as close as possible to its source of raw materials, energy, or its consumers. Ideally, at a point that optimizes all three. What do we see here? The ore for Vinius's factories was sourced from the Dedilov district, near the village of Brusyonki. The distance from there to the factories on the Tulitsa was 40 versts. 40 kilometers over the roadless terrain of the 17th century. And a blast furnace is a continuous cycle machine. It cannot simply be stopped and restarted. It requires a round-the-clock, year-round supply of huge quantities of raw material. Just imagine the titanic effort required to maintain this flow of ore on carts, through mud in the spring and autumn, and through snowstorms in winter. Charcoal, the second essential component, was produced from wood purchased from various landowners at distances of 5 to 15 versts. This means that fuel also had to be transported from afar. The result is an economically absurd picture. A complex industrial facility, consisting of 4 dams and several factories, is deliberately placed dozens of kilometers away from its raw material sources. It would have been incomparably simpler and cheaper to build the factories right next to the ore deposits near the town of Dedilov, or conversely, to build them in Tula and organize a centralized supply. But this was not done. And this was not an isolated case. If we look at a map of the first industrial enterprises that began to appear after 1632, the same pattern emerges. Factories are not built in cities. The second arms factory, founded in 1653 by the Dutchman Akema and the Hamburger Marcellis, appears not in Tula, a famous center of gunsmiths, but in the village of Chensovo on the Skaniga River. The only exception is a small barrel mill on the Yauza River in Moscow, opened in 1648. All other major cast iron and ironworks, which produced cannons and cannonballs, spring up in small villages in the Tula and Kaluga provinces. Podolsk, Kaluga, Kolomna, Serpukhov, all these significant cities are somehow left out of the industrial boom. Why? Why were the most advanced technologies of the time, requiring a concentration of resources and skilled labor, located in the rural backcountry, creating unimaginable logistical problems? The theory that ore deposits were nearby, as we've already seen, does not hold up. The reason must lie elsewhere. Such strange, economically disadvantageous logistics can mean only one thing. The factories were built not where it was convenient or profitable, but where it was somehow possible. This was not the logic of development, but of survival. It was as if some insurmountable obstacle prevented production from being located in major cities, despite all the obvious advantages. It was as if the cities themselves were unfit for life and work. This shocking assumption completely changes our view of the era of revival after the time of troubles. It suggests that the country's problems ran much deeper than mere political chaos. It forces us to ask, what was the real condition of Russian cities in the early 17th century if even foreign entrepreneurs, investing huge sums of money, preferred to build their factories in a wild field? The anomalous placement of the first factories leads us to a frightening and radical hypothesis. In the early 17th century, the major cities of central Russia were simply uninhabitable. They weren't just damaged during the time of troubles, they lay in ruins. And perhaps the issue wasn't just physical destruction. There's a suggestion that these areas were contaminated with something invisible and dangerous. Some factor that made people stay away. Today, we might call it radiological or chemical contamination. In those times, people might have perceived it as a cursed place, where mysterious illnesses began and life faded away. This would explain why no one wanted to return to the ruined cities to rebuild them. People were afraid. This fear was stronger than economic considerations or royal decrees. Therefore, industry had to be revived not in the cities, but in clean territories, in the countryside. This version also explains the strange choice of location for Vinius's factories. Why were they built not near the ore mines at Dedalov, nor in Tula itself, but specifically on the Tulitsa River, on the site of the old Tula settlement? The answer may be simple. Because this wasn't construction from scratch, but restoration. It's likely that some form of production already existed on this site before the catastrophe. Remnants of infrastructure had survived. Perhaps a partially destroyed dam, the foundation of a blast furnace, or a hammer mill. Foreign engineers, possessing knowledge and technology, were able to use this head start to launch production more quickly. Rebuilding on an old but safe site was easier and faster than starting from scratch in a completely wild field, or taking a risk by entering the contaminated ruins of the cities. We are dealing not with the founding of a new industry, but with the resuscitation of an old one on the surviving islands of a former civilization. In this context, the very term Garadisha, or settlement, takes on a new meaning. In official archaeology, it refers to the remains of ancient fortified settlements. But what if, in the context of the 17th century, the word had a much more immediate and relevant meaning? If we assume the world had experienced a global catastrophe, the survivors would have had to gather in small, well-defended communities. These Garadisha, mentioned in chronicles, could have been precisely such post-apocalyptic fortress settlements. They were fortified towns, built on hills and in river bends, capable of protecting their inhabitants from marauding gangs and the other dangers of a shattered world. A picture strikingly similar to scenes from the movie The Postman, or other works about a world after the end. And then, the logic of the factory's placement becomes perfectly clear. Vinius builds his dams and workshops at the foot of a hill, on top of which sits such an inhabited Gorodisha. This solved two key problems at once. First, it provided the production with a labor force, the very survivors who lived in the fortified settlement. Second, it offered some guarantee of security in a world where central authority was weak and chaos reigned. The factory was built under the protection of a community, for which it, in turn, became a source of sustenance and prosperity. The picture that emerges is this. Civilization was destroyed by a global cataclysm. Cities lay in ruins, possibly contaminated and dangerous. The survivors took refuge in small, fortified Garadisha, and it was on this basis, using the surviving fragments of old infrastructure and the labor of the inhabitants of these fortress settlements, that enterprising foreigners began to slowly, step by step, revive industrial production. This was not an era of formation, but an era of difficult, painful recovery from the ashes. But if this was the case, what level did this post-apocalyptic production reach? Was it primitive and artisanal, capable of satisfying only the minimal needs of a ravaged state? Or did the technologies, reborn on the ruins, turn out to be surprisingly advanced? The facts preserved in historical documents suggest the opposite, and hold yet another surprise for us. The idea of production being reborn after a catastrophe instinctively paints a picture of something primitive and crude. Small workshops, manual labor, low quality. This is what one would expect from a civilization trying to rise from the ruins. However, the description of Vinicius Gorodisha factories, preserved in a book from 1826, completely shatters this image of a dark age. What was created on the Tulitsa River was not just a workshop, but an industrial complex that was state-of-the-art by 17th century standards, based on the most modern technologies of the time. At the heart of the operation were two blast furnaces, over 4 meters high, lined with durable stone. Air was forced into them by two enormous wooden bellows, each almost 6 meters long, which were likely powered by water. The output of these furnaces is astonishing. Each one smelted over 3 tons of roasted ore per day, consuming 20 cartloads of charcoal in the process. The yield was about 2 tons of cast iron. These were serious industrial volumes. The technological process was meticulously planned. In front of each furnace was a special casting pit, where molds for cannons were placed. To lift the heavy cannons from these pits, a hoisting mechanism was used, a winch with an iron wheel mounted on an oak beam. Overseeing this complex process was a foreign master smelter, a certain Christian Wilde. But the work didn't end with casting. The factories had implemented advanced metal processing. Some of the cast iron was sent to a hammer mill, equipped with a large mechanical hammer and 2 forges. Here, the brittle cast iron was converted into malleable wrought iron, which was used, among other things, to forge the strips for musket barrels. The chief master blacksmiths were 3 foreign brothers, Martin, Yuri, and Lavrenti Schultz. But the most amazing part was the presence of high-tech equipment for the final finishing of the cannons. At the second dam, there was a workshop where, by the action of water, cannon barrels were bored from the inside and turned on the outside. These were genuine lathes and boring machines with hydraulic drives, the pinnacle of technology for that era. A similar boring mill and another hammer mill were located at the upper dam. And at the largest, 4th dam, near the village of Torkovo, there were as many as 3 hammer mills in operation. This was not just production. It was a full-fledged metallurgical cluster, with a division of labor and assembly line manufacturing. And here is the most astonishing fact, one that completely upends all notions of a recovery on its knees. These factories, built in the midst of a ruined world, did not just supply the domestic needs of the state. They produced goods of such high quality and in such quantities that they were exported to the most technologically advanced country of the time, the Netherlands. Historical documents impassively record. In 1646, just 14 years after the first factory was founded, over 600 cannons were shipped through Arkhangelsk to Holland. The following year, 1647, another 360 cannons, with calibers from 4 to 8 pounds, were exported. This is no longer mere survival. This is high-tech export. The world that, according to our hypothesis, lay in ruins, didn't just relearn how to smelt metal. It managed, in a very short time, to restore complex production chains and enter the premier international market with its products, competing with the best European manufacturers. This picture paints a completely different reality. A reality in which not only people survived the global catastrophe, but most importantly, knowledge. The foreign specialists who came to Russia were not just enterprising merchants. They were the carriers of the technologies of the previous lost world. And on this ravaged land, they were able to find both surviving infrastructure and people capable of restoring it and working with it. What we call post-apocalyptic production was, in fact, a rapid and incredibly successful revival of high technology. But this amazing story of catastrophe and a phoenix rising from the ashes in the 17th century may be just one piece of a much larger and more complex puzzle. Some researchers go even further, suggesting that this was far from the only end of the world in human history, and that our own civilization stands on the ruins of many others. This story of industrial revival in the 17th century ceases to be a unique phenomenon and becomes a link in a chain of far more grandiose and unsettling events. It leads us to a final, sweeping concept that completely reframes human history. According to this paradigm, our past is not a line of progressive development from simple to complex, but a series of global catastrophes followed by civilizational reboots. Each new era begins on the ruins of the previous one, preserving only fragments of its knowledge and technology. In this grand picture of the world, the early 17th century with its external impact was just one such finale. It was a catastrophe that destroyed a highly developed civilization of stone megalopolises, burned ancient forests, and covered the earth with a multi-meter-thick layer of clay, the ashes of a burned world. What we call the Time of Troubles and the subsequent revival was, in fact, the desperate struggle of survivors to recover lost knowledge in a world thrown back hundreds of years. But the cycle did not end there. The period of recovery was followed by new trials. Documents mention events resembling massive floods that washed away even sturdy factory dams, as happened in 1709. According to this timeline, there were at least two such floods that once again changed the landscape and struck a blow at a barely recovered humanity. After them came a relatively calm period of about 100 years, during which civilization made an incredible technological leap, perhaps even rediscovering the destructive power of the atom. This development led to the next, and for now, the last global catastrophe, which occurred in the 19th century. This was a war on a planetary scale, a conflict between a symbolic North and South, in which weapons of colossal destructive power were used. We see the consequences of this conflict everywhere, but we misinterpret them. The famous buried cities, with their ground floors submerged in soil, are not the result of a flood. They are the result of monstrous dust storms that raged across the planet after the war. Burned forests and a destroyed topsoil turned into billions of tons of dust, which strong winds carried around the globe, burying cities. And it is telling that these cities are built of brick, the material that people learned to make from the very clay that covered the earth after the 17th century catastrophe. Thus, the history we are familiar with is merely the last, very short chapter, written after another global cleansing. We live in a world that has only just begun to recover, and we mistake our brief period of calm for the entirety of time. And artifacts like the strange logistics of 17th century factories, their sudden technological sophistication, and the export of cannons to Europe cease to be mere historical puzzles. They become keys, material evidence that allows us to peer behind the curtain of official chronology and see the true, cyclical, and far more dramatic path of humanity.